Okay guys, I hope you're all doing well. I thought I'd make a short video to discuss with you the discussion questions that came at the very end of Up From Slavery. So we didn't really have time to go into the questions in depth. I thought I'd just make this short video to kind of discuss the questions and maybe give you a deeper understanding of the text, okay? So these are the discussion questions that I gave you guys. Let's look at the first one together. The first one says, what was life like on the plantation for the author? So guys, if you remember, if you go back to the text, you will find a lot of examples of just misery and, an abuse on the plantation. The author mentions simple things like his clothes. Life was hell for the author. I mean, the very clothes he wore on his back were just super uncomfortable. The food he ate, the place he lived, the things he had to witness, the horse, the taking things on the horse, where when the hay fell from the horse, he would cry and just wait for someone to come in and help him. The shoes, the wooden shoes he was wearing. So life was very, very tough. He couldn't spend time with his mother. He didn't really have time to spend with his siblings. As a child, he really didn't have any days where he had fun. So he mentions all of that in the autobiography. So what was life like on the plantation for the author? It was obviously hell. It was very, very difficult. And he was always scared of being punished, beaten, flogged, tortured, and so on, okay? The second question says, why wasn't his mother able to take proper care of him and his siblings? If you remember, this is also mentioned in the text. He mentions that he never had the time to actually sit and have a proper meal with his mother and his siblings. And he said that his mother didn't really have much time to take care of him because obviously she was also a slave. And so he only saw his mother very, very briefly in the morning when she woke them up and when she woke up herself, obviously. And she saw them for a brief moment just before they went to bed. And this would happen over and over again. And every time she woke up, obviously she would wake up her kids. She would see them, the mother would see her kids for a short while, but then she'd have to go back to work. She'd have to work from morning to night, obviously. So she had no choice because, his mother was also a slave. So because she was a slave, she wasn't able to take care of her kids in the proper sense of the term. Number 3 says, how did the author feel about his mother taking the chicken? So again, if we go back to this text, I'll just quickly show you. There's a whole passage about this actually. So it's this text over here. He says, one of my earliest recollections is that of my mother cooking a chicken late at night and awakening her children for the purpose of feeding them. How or where she got it, I do not know. I presume, however, it was procured from our owner's farm. Some people may call this theft. If such a thing were to happen now, I should condemn it as theft myself, but taking place at the time it did, and for the reason that it did, no one could ever make me believe that my mother was guilty of thieving. She was simply a victim of the system of slavery. So, the author does not believe that his mother stole the chicken. He believes that she rightfully took the chicken. He says if this thing were to happen today, then yes, obviously, if you go to like your neighbor's house and you take their chicken, then that is a good example of stealing or theft. But he states that, because we were slaves, because we were held against our own will, and we were fighting to eat, we were struggling to survive. So, stealing a chicken or taking a chicken from a farm is not really theft when you are a slave, when you are forced against your will. So this is a very interesting moral question, right? Is it theft when you are forced into slavery? So the author believes that no, his mom did not really, she did not really steal. She was just a victim, of her upbringing. She was a victim of her circumstances. And when you are kidnapped or when you are forced into slavery, then you have to do whatever it takes to survive, to protect yourself, okay? Number 4 says, how did the author feel about not getting an education? Again, I think for me, I might be a bit biased because I'm a teacher, but with this particular question, I was affected by this question, and I was affected by the part where he talks about education, because sometimes I think about the students we have, students who don't really appreciate, or students who don't really take their studies seriously, versus how this person saw education, right? So if you guys remember, if I go back to the text, there's a part where he talks about wanting to go to school And yeah, I mean, it's kind of profound, you know. It's very important to understand that you know slaves obviously had no right. They had, they were not allowed to get an education. They were not allowed to read books or write. And we talked about this because obviously knowledge is power, and you don't want to give your slaves power. You want to keep them ignorant. You want to keep them where they are. So knowledge is a form of, knowledge is like a form of freedom if you think about it. You know, you can free yourself. You can understand. You know, when you start reading and when you start getting knowledge, you start to question. You start to think. You start to analyze. Um, you start to understand, your basic rights and so on and so forth. So obviously, the white people did not want to educate their black people or their slaves. So here at the very end, he says, I had the feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise. So you guys can see from the text that education or going to school had a profound effect on the author, and it was one of his goals to actually get a proper education if he ever did become free. So yeah, it's very important. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we sometimes we take things for granted, and the slaves were obviously deprived of a lot of things, and one of them was, of course, getting a proper education. So he promised himself if he ever did become free, he would get an education, and that's exactly what he did. And because he did get an education, he was actually able to tell us the details of life as a slave. I mean, like, imagine if none of the slaves ever got educated after their freedom. I mean, who would tell us? Who would tell us the true nature of slavery? I don't think we're going to depend on their captors or the white man to tell us the nature of what slavery was like. Only the black people who did suffer, and only the ones who were kidnapped from their countries and forced into slavery can tell us the exact details of what slavery was actually like. In which part of the text did you feel sorry for the author? I mean, again, going back to the text, there are many instances where the author had to suffer. Obviously, everything from eating to clothing to everything, right? He was basically a slave. Obviously, he was a young boy, and I mean, everything he had, or everything he had to do, was basically forced upon him. He couldn't even sleep properly. His clothes were very uncomfortable. His shoes were uncomfortable. He had to witness, the white people eat delicious cakes, delicious food in the house. He would fan the flies for them. No education, obviously. So, I mean, this is a personal question, but there's a lot in the story that shows that this person did actually suffer a lot, and yeah, life obviously wasn't easy for him. The next question over here says, how does a text like this affect our understanding of history? So, again, guys, they say history is written by the victor. You cannot expect. I mean, you can't expect. I mean, like the white man, right, or white people, or the Europeans or Americans. They were the ones actually writing a lot of the literature that we have, that we kind of, that we read and appreciate today. But a text like this, written by a black man, gives us, let's say, a proper understanding of history, or gives us a more realistic understanding of history. Because if we have to depend on the white man to write history for us, then obviously they might leave out some of the details, some of the horrific details that the slaves had to go through. Because no one really wants to embarrass himself or herself. No one really wants to portray their country in a bad way, or their history in a bad way. But unfortunately, things like this did exist. So how does a text like this affect our understanding of history? Well, a text like this actually gives us the real side of things. We are able to fully understand the horrors that black people had to endure during the days of slavery. So I think it's very important. That this is again this also ties in with why education is very important. Education, I think, is very, very important, because when you educate someone, you are empowering them, and you're giving them the power to speak for themselves. You're giving them a voice. And luckily, Booker T. Washington, the person who wrote this text, or this autobiography, as I said, he was so inspired to get an education if he ever did become free, and he eventually did, and he was able to tell us firsthand what slavery, what it was to be like a slave. And this tells us a lot about today's education, because if you don't get an education, then you almost have like a slave mindset, and people will take advantage of your ignorance. So that's why we say knowledge is power. That's why knowledge is a form of freedom. When you are truly educated and you actually have knowledge, then in a way you are free as a human being. So I think, texts like these, a text like this written by a minority or someone who was abused, or let's say forced into slavery, is very, very important, because you can't expect. I mean, there will be people who will try to hide a text like this, by the way. And this ties into the next question. Some people claim that text like this should be banned because it causes hate among people and reopens old wounds. What do you think? I honestly think that a text like this should never be. I mean, should not be obviously banned. It shouldn't be censored either. A text like this should be given to as many people as possible, because we want to show people that history isn't all, sunshine and rainbows. And unfortunately, there were cultures or nations that did take advantage of other people, and this is perfect proof. So people have the right to know the truth of what happened in history. So texts like this really shed light on the horrors of the nature of human beings, and what we're capable of, and the cruelty that we were capable of. The next question says, find 3 examples that show suffering from the author's POV. Obviously, you can talk a bit about his living. Remember, the author said he never had a bed. He always slept on dirty towels on the floor. From the food, they were given, just old stale bread. They were thrown pieces of meat just here and there. From the clothing, from being he was a young boy, and he wasn't physically strong enough to carry things on a horse, and the things that the horse used to carry from point A to point B, and if the things on the horse fell, things like straw and hay and other materials, he wasn't physically strong enough to actually put them back on the horse. And he would sit crying the whole time. He would have to wait until someone stronger than him or bigger than him would come and help him. And if he arrived late back home, he would be beaten or flogged. So there are tons of examples. I mean, the whole text is just him showing us how tough life was, from not knowing who his dad was because his mother was, obviously abused, to staring at his captors eating delicious food, from him being used as a guy who would fan the flies. So I mean, everything about this story, or everything about this text, is just very, very depressing. It's very, very tragic. And as I said before, remember, this isn't really a story. It's not fiction. This is actually everything you read in the text actually happened in real life, unfortunately. Why didn't the author know more about his family's history? Again, when the white people, again, this is all the way in the beginning, when white people forcefully took the Africans from Africa, they didn't really care about the family records of the black people. They would just obviously take them, kidnap them as slaves, and they would buy them and sell them in the markets, and they were basically seen as property, as inferior human beings. And just like you'd buy a cow or a horse, they would also buy another human being, unfortunately. So the history of the family wasn't really important. This was mentioned in the beginning of the text. And and obviously his mother was abused, and he was the product of that abuse. The author was the product of that abuse, so he knew nothing about his father, and he didn't really know much about his family's history, unfortunately. Is it okay to steal if you're a slave? So again, this ties back to the question about his mother taking the chicken. Is it okay to steal if you're a slave? Some people will say yes, it is okay. Some people will say no, because stealing is stealing. It's never right. It's never okay to justify stealing, no matter what the circumstances are. So that's one point of view. But then another point of view can argue that well, if you are forced against your own will, if you are kidnapped or taken as a prisoner against your own will, then you have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to fight for your freedom. You have the right to fight for your survival. So it really depends on how you see the situation, but I think it's important to think of both sides of the coin. But obviously, if I had to answer this question myself, I would obviously justify the stealing, because if you are put into such horrible conditions against your will, where you had no say in where you are, then obviously you have the right to, fight for your own survival. And she remember she stole the chicken to feed her children. So yeah, I mean, they never gave them proper food. Obviously, they never had the right nutrition. So this was, in a way, it was a way to kind of rebel, kind of quietly. It was a way for them to get the energy and the nutrition that they actually needed to survive on this farm. And then the last one obviously also ties with the issue of education and reading and writing. Why was it important to keep the slaves uneducated? As I mentioned before, knowledge, education gives you power. It makes you more aware of who you are as a person, and of where you're living and what's right and what's wrong, and so on and so forth. Education and knowledge basically make you think, they make you question, they make you discover, they make you ponder. And you don't obviously want your slave to do that. You want to keep your slave uneducated because you want to have the upper hand. You want him or her to believe everything you say. You want the slaves to live according to your standards. You don't want the slave to think. You don't want the slave to start questioning what you're doing, and so on and so forth. So it was very, very important at the time to keep slaves, uneducated. It was important to keep the slaves, where they were, and that's how the white people had the upper hand, by keeping them ignorant. Because if you are ignorant, then someone can actually take advantage of that ignorance, and they can sway you the way they want to sway you. They can make you believe whatever they want to believe, whatever they want you to believe. And this is why it's important in today's world to get an education. Because if you are truly educated, then you cannot be enslaved, you cannot be swayed, you cannot be deceived if you get a proper education. Whereas if you don't get a proper education, you can easily be, swayed, you can easily be convinced, you can easily be fooled. You might actually end up believing someone's, let's say, wrong point of view, or you might believe someone, you might fall into someone's trap simply because you are not educated enough yourself. So it was very, very important to keep the slaves uneducated. They wanted to kind of keep them inferior. They didn't really want the slaves to rebel or to fight back or to think intellectually, obviously. And this was one form of abuse, intellectual abuse, in a way. So yeah, that's it for the discussion questions, guys. Thank you so much for checking this out. And don't forget to watch this movie. And hopefully I'll see you guys in class.